Chapter 13 covers advanced topics in business strategy. And what we mean is we're going to pull together various elements from the prior chapters. Chapters on the industry structure, how monopolies and oligopolies work, then game theory, and also time value of money. So this chapter covers the dynamic environment that's closer to what we see in real life. The learning objectives are first to look at the economic basis for limit pricing and identify conditions where that would be profitable for a monopoly to engage in. Second is look at the economic basis for predatory pricing. Third, how does a manager lessen competition by raising the rival's costs? Fourth, what are the legal ramifications of these business strategies? Fifth, how can a firm's profit be enhanced by changing the timing of decisions from simultaneous to sequential? Next, look at the examples of networks and network externalities and how connections are possible using a star network. And finally, explain why networks often lead to first mover advantages and how to use strategies such as penetration pricing to favorably change the strategic environment. So there's quite a bit of stuff in this chapter, but it does explain what's going on in some of the big battles we see in the marketplace. First, let's start with limit pricing. The idea of limit pricing is a monopoly may choose voluntarily to lower the price. So therefore, the gamble is, would a monopoly rather be a monopoly and invite competition, or would they do something to try to preempt the entry of a competitor by use of limit pricing? Let's start with the review of monopoly pricing. This should be very familiar to you right now. Monopolies face a downward sloping demand curve. Therefore, their marginal revenue also is downward sloping, and their marginal cost is like any other company, shows economies and then diseconomies. The price that would be optimal for a monopoly, if it can maintain that monopoly position, is where the marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and then we read that up to the demand curve to get the price that monopoly would charge. So the monopoly will love this, to produce QM and to price it at PM. Notice that if the ATC is above the marginal revenue, we're going to be okay because we'll be able to have a profit. Again, as we saw in the earlier chapter, it's not always the case that the average total cost is above the price. So let's assume this is a favorable economic environment for the monopoly. The profit then is the little rectangle between the price charged and the average total cost at QM. So that rectangle represents the profit, where the bigger rectangle right here, this entire thing, represents the total revenue to the monopoly. All right, so now let's look at how we can use limit pricing, or at least the theory of limit pricing. We see that the monopoly is at QM. We see also that it's possible to determine a quantity, call it QL for limit, such that the price is lower, driving up the quantity sold by the monopoly. What that effectively does is create what we call a residual demand curve for the second entry. Here's how the residual demand curve works. If we're at QL, that means we've produced this quantity. And if someone were to enter, we've already sold this amount. So what remains is right here. What remains is this amount at that price, and then the slope will go down. So you could see the almost parallel nature of the primary demand curve and then the residual demand curve. So they're facing that from $1. So they're facing a less attractive price to begin with. Also notice that if they look at where the price is set at the PL, it is at a price where they may not be able to produce at a profitable level. Again, if the demand is here, the entry would be more difficult because the average cost curve may be such that it doesn't allow for the entrant to make money. So that's the idea for the monopoly. Let's lower the price, taking away more of the demand at the lower price. Thereby, what's left is not sufficient for the new entrant to make money. Notice that in this case, if you look at the average cost curve for the new entrant, and we assume for simplicity that they have the identical cost structure as a monopolist, which is a bit generous, but let's take that as an extreme condition. So we see that any point of quantity which is greater than Q would be such that the demand faced is going to have lower revenue than the average cost curve. So this is not a very attractive condition for the second entry. Now there may be instances where limit pricing fails to deter entry. And because we're assuming, first let's make the assumption that's most unfavorable for the monopolist. So we assume that the entrant has complete information. Again, we're going to try to hide things if we're the monopolist, but let's say that's unsuccessful and the new entrant knows all these things about what you know. So that means you can't hide information about the profitability of your business. The other element of limit pricing is the low price charged by the incumbent did not prevent entry. The entrant stayed out because they believed the incumbent would stay at QL. Because if there is a game being played such that the monopolist artificially or temporarily lowers the price, if the new entrant believes that the monopolist would revert to a lower quantity and higher price, then that gives them room to enter. There's a game theory dynamic happening here where the monopolist does things so that the new entry feels that this is not a temporary move, that this quantity is going to stay there, thereby making it not just a temporary drop in price, but one that's going to continue, again, deterring entry. So a revised strategy, what you might think for the monopolist is let's stay with the monopoly price and then produce monopoly output and then threaten to increase the quantity if entry occurs. So it's almost daring people to come in. So as they come in, you punish them, using game theory words again, punish them by dropping the price and increasing the quantity. And this, however, is not credible because the entry knows that it may be in the monopolist's best interest to threaten it, maybe even do it, but at some point revert to a higher price and a lower quantity. So the threat may not be credible to the entrant as they look at all the conditions from the monopoly and what their signaling and prior actions have shown. So for limit pricing to be effective, we have to look at rational competitors, and we have to look at the pre-entry price compared to the post-entry profits, the long term, in other words. Here are some things that the monopolist can do to try to better their case and prevent entry. First is what we call commitment mechanisms. And this is like throwing your anchors away, which shows your intensity of going out to war, right? So here we're going to purposely increase our scale so that it's not only we can increase output, we will increase output. This might mean building a bigger plant or building a larger facility so it shows it's not a temporary condition, that you're serious about maintaining this volume for a long, long time. Second is learning curve. We talked about this a little bit in class, that there's a core idea behind Bain and BCG thinking, where if you have more experience, in other words, you have more quantity that you've produced cumulatively, then you have the ability to lower your cost, thereby building a buffer between you and the new entrants. So if there's belief that the monopoly can gather enough volume from all its accumulated experience to drive their costs lower, that makes it even more difficult to sustain attack against the incumbent. The other is incomplete information. We assume that perfect information was had by all the potential entrants. But what if we can do trade secrets or otherwise disguise or hide information so nobody knows how profitable it is? And finally, reputation effects. And this is reputation for being tough. So if there is the belief that the incumbent defends its turf and will sustain for long periods of time the tough positions, then the new entrant may think twice about picking that opponent to battle. So these are all things that could reinforce and deter the entry, which are partly economic and partly based on signaling and things that we saw in the last chapter.